Thank you for joining us for tonight's program on crisis in Lebanon with Mona Yacoubian and Dr. Eric Bordenkircher. I'm Claire Noble, the Director of Programming for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our Executive Director, Dale Mosier, our Board Chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium Board, welcome. Tonight's program is the first of our winter season. The Vail Symposium has been convening locally and thinking globally since 1971. 2 items to be aware of before we get started this evening. Use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for tonight's speakers. We'll get to those questions later in the program, and we'll get to as many as time permits. Tonight's program will run until 7 p.m. It's being recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording at vailsymposium.org. I'd like to thank the organizations and individuals who've helped make tonight's program possible. Our sponsors include the Town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Antlers at Vail, and the Vail Daily. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. Jeannie and Dale Mosier have underwritten the winter season. Cindy Ingalls has underwritten the geopolitical series. And our underwriters for tonight's program are Ann and Tom Radar. The Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. Thank you to all of our donors. We couldn't do it without you. Our next program is on December 14th, a week from tonight, also a webinar, Crafting a Purpose-Driven Life. Bob and Greg Vanerick discuss life, work, and family. Tonight's program focuses on Lebanon, why the country is in turmoil, and why it should matter to Americans. Our distinguished guests include Dr. Eric Bordenkircher, who is currently a research fellow at UCLA Center for Middle East Development, and lectures in the Political Science Department at George Washington University, a former visiting assistant professor at Claremont McKenna College and Pepperdine University. He focuses on Lebanese and Iraqi politics, US relations and policy toward the Middle East, progressives and US foreign policy, the Arab-Israeli conflict, Islamic movements, governance, and the impact of globalization. Mona Yacoubian is Senior Advisor to the Vice President of Middle East and Africa at the United States Institute of Peace. Her work centers on conflict analysis and prevention in the Middle East with a specific focus on Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. She was a Fulbright Scholar in Syria at the University of Damascus. She has held an International Affairs Fellowship with the Council on Foreign Relations and is currently a Council on Foreign Relations member. She earned a master's in public administration from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and a bachelor's from Duke University. You could find more extensive bios for both of our speakers this evening on our website, vailsymposium.org. I'd like to hand the program over to our 2 guests and start with this question. Why does Lebanon matter to America? And I'll turn to you, Eric, for the answer to this first question.
Thank you, Claire, for the invitation tonight and the warm welcome. And it's a pleasure here to be able to speak to Mona. Mona, I never told you this, but I've been familiar with your work for many years, and I cited you in my dissertation. So this is a great opportunity to speak with you and to maybe hopefully learn further from you. I've been tasked here this evening with kind of acting as the moderator. So I'm going to take the ball from Claire and I'm going to actually pass it on to Mona. And we're going to address this question in regards to why does Lebanon matter, particularly from the United States, and why should we care about Lebanon? So I'm going to let Mona answer the question initially, and then I will hopefully build upon her response and hopefully maybe also provide some alternative opinions to create a certain discussion and to elicit, I hope, curiosity on our participants here tonight. So the mic is yours, Mona, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thanks so much, Eric. I appreciate it. And Claire, thank you as well. And of course, my thanks to the Vail Symposium for inviting me this evening. I really appreciate the fact that you all are out there in beautiful, snowy, I hope, Colorado, far from Lebanon, and yet there is this deep interest in it. And I think that's really important. And here's why. First, I'd say, given the interconnected and interdependent world that we live in, driven by globalization, by technology, it's very hard, I think, for us to be walled off from many kinds of complex challenges and threats. The pandemic, of course, is in some ways the most immediate one that we're all dealing with. We know that there are issues with climate change, disinformation, all kinds of complex challenges that don't respect borders and that affect us, though they may originate far away, affect us here at home. Lebanon is let me drill down a little bit on the specifics of Lebanon and just start by saying Lebanon is in the throes of an economic meltdown, which is considered by the World Bank to be one of the worst in the past 150 years. This is a country that has gone from being a solidly middle-income country, like an Argentina-like country, to a country that now has nearly 80% of its population living below the poverty line, a quarter of the population food insecure, 85% of people don't know how they can make ends meet. All of this happened in the span of 2 years. It started in 2019, the most immediate triggers of the crisis. And Eric, you and I, I'm sure, will go back and forth and unpack in much more detail, how Lebanon came to the precipice of where it is now, which is it's sitting on the verge of almost total collapse. So why should we care about that here? This small Mediterranean country on the Eastern Med, thousands of miles away. And I'd offer a few reasons why I think we should care. One is that when governments collapse and states collapse, as we may see in Lebanon, that ends up opening all kinds of security vacuums that are often filled by what in Washington speak we call malign actors. Whether it's Islamic or extremist groups, jihadist groups that have a presence in Lebanon, but that can take advantage of a lack of security to recruit and even potentially plan attacks is one issue. The other, of course, is the presence of an Iranian-backed militia, Hezbollah. And of course, Iran is a key adversary of the United States. Hezbollah already has the preponderance of power and influence on the ground. And if Lebanon ended up in a total meltdown, Hezbollah is best poised to weather that kind of disruption and may indeed become even more powerful. And I think two other points I would raise. One is what we also have seen is that when states and countries are in chaos and when economies collapse, we end up often seeing people on the move, people migrating, people leaving, people seeking a better life because they simply cannot survive in their current country. We see displacement, as we call it. And we've seen it certainly from conflict in places like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. In Lebanon, I think there is real concern that if the country continues on this sort of downward trajectory, we could actually see large-scale displacement toward Europe. And we've already learned from the 2015 refugee crisis that hit Europe that those kinds of large-scale displacements often have political ramifications, reverberations, not only in Europe, but even beyond, I would argue even here to the United States. One other point about Lebanon we should bear in mind, Lebanon has the highest number of refugees per capita in the world. So it hosts a large number of Syrian refugees, which is no surprise because Syria is right next door. And as Syria devolved into conflict, many, many Syrians sought refuge in Lebanon. And so not only do you have the prospect of vulnerable Lebanese taking potentially to boats to Cyprus or somehow seeking to leave the country, but you also have this large number of Syrian refugees, by most estimates over 1 million, who already live in incredibly dire circumstances. More than 90% live below the poverty line. And so as the country continues to unravel, we could see Syrian refugees also on the move again, all of which creates, I think, a very, very destabilizing environment. And of course, Lebanon sits at the edge of the Middle East, a region of the world that's already under a great deal of turmoil, and further sort of turmoil and escalation of tensions is not going to be a good thing, not for our allies, whether it's Israel, which of course borders Lebanon to Lebanon's south, Jordan, which doesn't share a direct border with Lebanon, but is there in the neighborhood. And so for all of these reasons, I think this is why Americans should care about what happens in Lebanon and why and how it could even impact us directly here at home. Eric, let me stop there and hand it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Mona. I 100% agree with you in regards to the elements of the failed state and the refugee situation that could precipitate from a further denigration of the Lebanese state. I think the thing about Lebanon that is a little different than what we've seen here in the Middle East recently is that we don't have an active civil war here. We don't have active violence, and there's just a kind of slow deterioration. The Lebanese kind of limp on and, you know, make do and try to, as I think my friend one time told me in Beirut, you know, it's always kind of resorting to plan B about how to kind of live life. You don't have plan A, you have plan B. And then also too, my experiences in Lebanon is because of this stability and that people can never really kind of plan or look forward to the future. I think one of the things though, I think we need to also mention is that this Lebanese situation, while it has exacerbated within the last 2 years, has been a problem for quite some time. And the Lebanese fought a 15-year civil war, and the resolution to that civil war really didn't resolve the problems between the Lebanese. You could say it was a more kind of cosmetic resolution. And since the Syrians left Lebanon in 2005, Lebanon has been on a kind of precipitous decline ever since then. And we've seen it in regards to violence breaking out in Beirut in around 2007, 2008. We see it with the garbage crisis around 2015. So these problems are ongoing. They've just been, I would say, exacerbated by the recent economic meltdown, compounded by the port blast in Beirut. One of the things you alluded to, and I think probably also, I think our audience probably should learn a little more about, is this interference interference participation from the outside world. And that Lebanon has you could say, a high rate of intervention in its internal affairs. And that this behavior has been kind of part and parcel to Lebanon even prior to the establishment of the Lebanese state, and dates back centuries, where the Europeans and the minorities of this area colluded against other Europeans, colluded against the Ottomans, colluded against other minorities. So there is a history here, there's a precedent that has been in practice for centuries, where minority groups look outside for external help, external assistance, and also external actors look to interfere in Lebanon to promote their own agenda, whether it be domestically in Lebanon or at the regional level. And this, coupled with this emphasis in Lebanon to be a country, to be a government that represents all through the institutionalization of identity, has created a particularly complex, challenging environment to make or to create consensus, to create agreement, not just between the Lebanese themselves, but between the external actors as well. And you know what Mona has discussed about, and what these last couple of years have particularly demonstrated, is that Lebanon is a very challenging environment to navigate politically. And the people who end up suffering from this are the civilians. And as Mona has mentioned, is that this, creates a danger of migration, refugees. And I think we both agree, and we probably both know people, is that Lebanese have been leaving the country for years. It's accelerated here of late, and we're seeing an increasing brain drain on Lebanese, which creates an even more precarious, a more pessimistic future for the Lebanese, that this educated class, and Lebanon is quite exceptional or unique in the sense that you have a very educated class in Lebanon compared to a lot of the other countries in the Middle East and the Arab world. And that this one asset is slowly disappearing, if not quickly disappearing, in the midst of this economic meltdown. And this bodes or does not bode well for the any kind of reestablishment, any kind of resurgence or rebuilding of the state, because these people are going to be or supposed to be, elements, pillars of that society. And so maybe I'll pass the ball back to here, Mona, if you want to build on that.
Sure. No, you've touched on several things. I mean, I think maybe let me pick up on the last thing you said first, which is this notion of brain drain and frankly, again, this transformation that we're seeing before our eyes at lightning speed of a country that was once very solidly middle income. Some may recall Beirut was once called the Paris of the Middle East. And this is a country, despite all of its problems, and it has many, is also known for this sort of urbane sophistication and a deep, deep history and a mosaic of many religious and ethnic sects that makes it somewhat, not totally, somewhat unique in the Middle East. But fully 65% of Lebanon's population says, this is according to a Gallup poll very recently done, that if they would wish to leave the country permanently. That's 2/3 of its population. So to your point, Eric, about brain drain, and the smartest, not the smartest, but the people who are most skilled, who are most able, are leaving. Doctors and nurses and professors and others. And so already we're beginning to see a structural shift, a structural change in the country in its very character that could really alter this country maybe forever. And that's why I think it's really important to be paying close attention to what's happening. You also, though, allude to this notion of outsiders playing a role in Lebanon, which is so very true, over decades, maybe even centuries, where there are outside players who seek to gain advantage and often use Lebanon as an arena to play out various kinds of proxy battles, if you will. And there are these various Lebanese communities who have in turn also looked to the outside, looked to patrons to support them. It is a diverse country. It is a country made up of 18 recognized confessions and sects. Very crudely, the primary division being between Muslim and Christian. And what's really interesting is, of course, Lebanon was formed or established almost 100 years ago, a little more than, in 1920, at the end of the Ottoman Empire. And it was created through the Maronite Christian-dominated Mount Lebanon, carved out by the French, precisely to have a Christian-dominated landmass or country carved out of what was then called Greater Syria. So you see already the seeds of issues around sect, identity, orientation, right? Western-oriented, European-oriented Christians, as opposed to Muslims who hearkened more toward the East, toward the Muslim world, toward the Arab world. And as you rightly point out, those divisions between Christian and Muslim have thread their way through Lebanon's system of governance throughout its history. Certainly upon its independence from France, it was a French mandate or through the 20s and 30s until 1943, when Lebanon gained its independence, and then was put in place a pretty rigid structure of governance in which the president would always be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of the parliament a Shia Muslim. And then even down from there, various confessions and sects. There are several different Christian sects. There are also Alawite Muslims and Druze and others. There are formulas that dictate and determine both elements of the cabinet as well as the parliament, which is 50% Christian, 50% Muslim. So I see a question about, relations between Muslims and Christians. Well, this was a key issue that provoked, of course, the Civil War and the very tense relations between Christians and Muslims. There's been no formal census taken in Lebanon since 1932. And that's because the issues of the demographics of the country are so sensitive. And so there is a long and difficult past that the country has that is rife with civil war, with sectarian tension. But I do want to fast forward to where we are today, because this moment of crisis, as I said, dates to very specifically October of 2019. And at that point, the country, which was already in the throes of a pretty significant economic decline, and we can talk about that a bit more. It was essentially what was described as a Ponzi scheme economy, in which fairly corrupt system of banks and the central bank were seeking to maintain and keep the economy afloat by attracting dollars and giving these dollar depositors, primarily in the Lebanese diaspora, artificially high interest rates on their deposits. And it worked as long as you kept having fresh dollars come in, attracted by the prospect of these high interest rates, which were artificially high. So you set in place this sort of Ponzi scheme. The key elements, though, that there were key issues that began to undermine this system. You had war in Syria breaking out in 2011. You had growing tensions between Sunni Saudi Arabia and, as I said, the Shia militia Hezbollah, which is sponsored, which receives patronage from Iran, so that the Saudis in particular and Sunni Gulf Arabs more broadly decided to pull out their investment, to stop sending investment dollars into Lebanon, all of which began, along with other factors, this slow motion collapse of the Lebanese financial and banking sector. And that is really what has provoked, that is sort of in my view anyway, the underlying crisis that has driven all of what we're seeing. Just to put a few statistics, and then I'll turn it back to you, Eric, but I think it's important for our audience to understand the dimensions of the crisis that Lebanon's in. Lebanon's currency has depreciated by more than 90%. So that has set in motion triple-digit inflation. Food prices have risen 18-fold. I have family in Lebanon, and these are solidly middle-income people, and they are having a difficult time affording meat, for example. They are living more on rice and lentils, which is pretty humbling to think about. You're also seeing, of course, as I said, growing poverty, 80% under the poverty line. That then has other knock-on effects. As families grow more impoverished, they end up not having their children go to school, but actually have their children work. So you have issues with child labor. You have issues with children dropping out of school. All of these sort of set in train this vicious cycle. So you have this financial meltdown. You have COVID, which actually exacerbates and accelerates the financial meltdown because of the economic impacts of COVID-enforced lockdowns. And then you have, as Eric noted, the Beirut port blast of August 4, 2020. And we can talk about that. But that, in my view, the August 4 port blast, the largest non-nuclear explosion since the end of World War II, was the direct result of government corruption and malfeasance, it was due to improperly stored explosive chemicals in the port. Not entirely clear what triggered the blast, but it leveled several neighborhoods in the central districts of Beirut, of course, destroyed the port, 200 or more people killed, thousands injured. And really, it's about government corruption and malfeasance as to how these chemicals stayed for years, poorly stored, and no one has been held to account. So I want to end this part of my intervention on this point. People often think about Lebanon as sort of a pawn amongst external players, whether it's in the region between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or the US involved, and others. I think that distracts from the primary issue today in Lebanon, which is about 30 years of corruption and a patronage system that enriches a privileged few in the elite and leaves the vast majority of the Lebanese without adequate government services, without a government that responds to their needs. And the reason I say this is because those protests that erupted in October of 2019, prompted by a tax that people thought was unfair and their overall suffering, those protests were cross-sectarian. The people across sects came together to say, enough is enough. We are done. All of our leaders are criminal. All of our leaders are corrupt. And so you actually have seen this shift from sectarianism driving tensions in the country to, I would say, a very significant divide between a very corrupt and entrenched elite and the rest of the Lebanese people. And this elite is so corrupt that they are willing to see their country literally burn, literally collapse, rather than undertake the kinds of reforms that are deemed critical to resolving, saving the country. Why? Because they don't want to lose their own privileges. So I think sectarianism is a very important driver in Lebanon, but far from the only one, and we should understand better these issues around governance, lack of accountability, pervasive corruption. I'll stop there.
So it sounds like maybe we should start to now look towards the future, and Mona and I will start to maybe present some different opinions in regards to where we see things going, and also policy recommendations, particularly maybe from the perspective of the American government. And maybe to just build on what Mona has said is that what she has said in a lot of regards is just the tip of the iceberg, and that, you know, you can add to the fact of, you know, the financial meltdown, the Beirut port blast. You had a government that is not meeting right now. You didn't have a government for a period of time during the COVID. You had the resignation of the government in 2019, and then basically the absence of the government for a particularly long time, which in a lot of regards is kind of the norm for Lebanoners, becoming increasingly the norm. You have a Lebanese militia who is fighting a war in another country right now that is not supported by the quote unquote Lebanese state. So there's a lot here to kind of unpack, and we could go layer by layer by layer. Mona had brought up I think a pivotal and kind of a critical issue here is these protests and where kind of things will go. Will the Lebanese start to move away from this kind of sectarian mentality, or will they kind of be pulled back in by these elites who have been able to dominate and manipulate the situation before? And I think one of the challenges, and this is probably one of the dilemmas that faces the US government here going forward, is that, you know, what is going to come out of these protests, what has come out. And from my perspective, it's still a bit too early to tell, but at the same time, I don't see anything particularly coalescing, particularly prominent. And I think we can look at Lebanon going back to 2015, where they had protests about the garbage, and that the Lebanese state was incapable of removing the garbage from the streets and then also putting it into the dumps. And this elicited a response from the civil society in Lebanon. And initially it was quite positive, and it seemed to be creating change. And you had municipal elections shortly after these demonstrations where these civil society elements succeeded in taking a significant number of seats in the municipal elections. But when time came for the parliamentary elections, these groups basically became victim to the Lebanese the Lebanese problems, and that there was too many divisions to create a kind of a significant movement here to challenge these traditional elites. So I was in Beirut in 2018, early 2019, trying to interview people, and I talked to one party called Saba, and then there was a lot of discussion in regards to this civil society movement called Beirut Medinati, but they were never able to coalesce into a party and to present a certain kind of platform on what they wanted to do. And I think this is the challenge going forward in regards to these latest demonstrations, is that the Lebanese are against these elites, but the problem or the issue is what is the step after that? They agree on opposing those elites, but there's a lot of disagreement in regards to what should follow. And I think this is where the brain drain is particularly damaging to this future of Lebanon, is that the educated individuals from like AUB, from USG, are leaving the country. And I would say to a certain extent are probably turning their back on the country as well. And because of this, I have a particularly kind of pessimistic outlook for Lebanon in the short and the medium term here in regards to what change can be manifested. And I think it has to be a slow change. I think it's going to be a painful change. But at the end of the day, I think the most critical thing here is that the Lebanese themselves need to believe in Lebanon. And this is one of the problems throughout Lebanese history, as we've alluded to over the last 30 minutes, is that when you have a country that institutionalizes identity, particularly religious identity, compounded by this external influence, by this external interference, this external patronage, it rips at the fabric of the society, and people don't see themselves as Lebanese per se. They see themselves as Maronite Catholic. They see themselves as Sunni Muslim. They see themselves as Druze. And because of this, the belief in what is Lebanon is very challenging, because they have different ideas of who the Lebanese are, in a sense. I've been in discussions where the Lebanese will say, well, they're Lebanese, these others we don't really identify with. And you have an already divided society. So I think the challenge going forward is kind of creating a semblance of unity amongst this protest movement that is going to be able to challenge these elites who have money, who have support from external actors, to overcome and, in a sense, to change the status quo. So I'll pass the ball back here to Mona.
Well, I think you put your finger on a key challenge in Lebanon, and not only Lebanon, but across the Arab world. Because remember, we saw in late 2010 with Bouazizi, the Tunisian fruit seller who immolated himself and set off what was initially called the Arab Spring. That term quickly went away for reasons I think we all know as we see what's happened over the past 10 years. But interestingly enough, the protests that took place in Lebanon in 2019 were part of what many were calling a second round of Arab Spring-like protests that have also been taking place in Iraq and Sudan. We see what happened in Sudan, in Algeria and other places. And Eric, you put your finger, though, on a key challenge that those demanding change have always come up against, which is how to translate street protests and often unorganized, inchoate protest movements into political action and real political change. And very few places have we seen that. Lebanon, of course, is one of them. And you're right. You rightly point out things like what was the garbage crisis, which was called the You Stink campaign. I was working at USAID at the time, where the government couldn't perform the most basic services like garbage pickup. And same with things like electricity. Lebanese have forever had to rely on generators for a good portion of their power, not because the country doesn't have the capacity, it does, to generate enough electricity. It's not a huge country, it's 6 million people. The issue is the corruption and the ineptitude of the utilities and the electricity sector, and the ways in which they are captive to these very corrupt sectarian interests. But what's interesting is that, again, I'd like to point out that there is a strong sense of Lebanese identity. As a Lebanese American, I can say that. And yes, there are divisions and there are differences, but there's also a strong pulling together. And the Lebanese diaspora is one of the largest in the world and has played a really interesting role in trying to help the Lebanese people. What's going to be critical, Eric, I think, is the next elections, which are scheduled for 2022. Date to be determined, possibly late March. They were calling for them early. Maybe it'll revert back to the original date in May. That's going to be key, where you have these groups that have mobilized, even with all of the hardship, even with COVID, even after the port explosions, even with this growing impoverishment, you still have a core group of Lebanese activists from across the country, from across confessions, who are demanding better. And so the question will be, to what extent can they perform and maybe even gain some seats in the parliament? It's a long shot. I was an election observer in the 2018 election. Only one independent made it into the parliament. And I was able to watch firsthand as an observer how this corrupt patron-client system that characterizes politics in Lebanon, where one is beholden to their confessional leader to get jobs, to get services. And so your vote is a deal. It's about patronage. And it's very difficult to break that cycle. But if these independents that have continued to mobilize and demand change can play a role in beginning, and I agree with Eric, it has to be gradual change. That's the route toward peaceful change in Lebanon, through free and fair elections that are held on time, that have a level playing field, and ideally where some of these independents can make a difference and have an influence and begin what will be, no doubt, a long, slow change toward a better future. One other point, though, I think we do need to bring up the idea, the need for these deep economic reforms, the complete restructuring of the banking sector and a restructuring of the electricity sector and a creation of a social safety net to help with this growing impoverishment. These are the reforms that the current entrenched elite refuse to take, and therefore Lebanon has not been able to avail itself of an IMF bailout rescue package, which is typically what would happen with a country in this kind of dire straits. But the IMF and the international community rightly is saying, no more aid to the Lebanese government, no more financial assistance unless and until the government begins to really implement the kinds of reforms that many deem critical for beginning to rescue the country and turn it around. And again, up until now, the elite would rather hold on to the perquisites of their power and again, watch the country collapse rather than implement the kinds of reforms that the IMF and the international community more broadly, to include our government, are saying are critical to rescue this country and begin to turn things around.
Would you like me to add to that, Mona?
Sure.
I guess the one thing too for our audience is we really haven't talked about this a whole lot. There's another elephant in the room, and that's Hezbollah. And I do wonder with this, you know, if we want to call it a burgeoning kind of democratic, secular, or non-sectarian movement, that Hezbollah has acted with impunity in Lebanon. And particularly within the Shia community, we saw this of late with the killing of Luqman Saleem. And it creates inability to have diversity, particularly within the Shia community. And the Shia community today, even though there hasn't been a census, is the largest community in Lebanon. And it's an art, you know, at least an element or a part of it is an armed community. So this, in a sense, complicates the situation, creates more intransigence in regards to trying to change the status quo, and makes operating in Lebanon, and here maybe we're starting to run out of time here, I don't know if we want to talk about policy, but creates a kind of very dicey situation in order how the international community should deal with this country.
Maybe I'll just jump in on the Hezbollah question, and I've certainly mentioned it as being, again, this non-state actor militia with the preponderance of power on the ground. Its force of arms is greater than that of the Lebanese armed forces or the army. So this is a real issue. This is a real challenge for Lebanon. And you know, in my view, the most powerful antidote to a militia is to create strong state institutions that are accountable to their people. Hezbollah benefits from chaos. Hezbollah benefits from weak governance and popular disaffection. So the extent to which the international community can continue to push Lebanon toward the creation of accountable, transparent, effective state institutions, that is the most effective way to counter a militia like Hezbollah. It's the same challenge that we're seeing in Iraq, by the way, with the Iranian-backed militias that you see in Iraq. Same challenge, same issue. Not easy to solve. And I think, you know, in some ways we're sort of already tending now toward, and maybe I'll just offer a few thoughts. And I see Claire on, and I know there's some questions, but some few quick thoughts on, so what should the US be doing about this, right? I mean, I think we've established that Lebanon's collapsing is not in the US national security interest, and it could indeed have detrimental impacts that reverberate even to our shores. So what should we be doing? And you know, I've spoken on this, I testified on this question to Congress this past summer. I've thought about it quite a bit in my time in both in government and at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And I think our engagement has to be, you know, threefold. One is it's really important to continue to address this humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding in Lebanon. Lebanon is becoming the region's latest humanitarian basket case, a region that cannot afford any more humanitarian basket cases. And here the issue is really making sure that assistance, food assistance, cash assistance goes directly into the hands of Lebanon's most vulnerable and impoverished people. And this is absolutely doable, and it's being done through the World Bank, through the UN, not through the Lebanese government because of its corrupt practices. So that's point one. Point two is to continue to push on this point of the need for reform and the need to get with an IMF program. It's not rocket science what they need to do. It's very clear these reforms have been on the table literally for years. The US, I think, has a very important role as a leader, along with France, to play in pushing and pressuring the Lebanese government to do right by its people, to do what needs to be done. And third is to insist that these elections slated for 2022 take place on time, take place in a free and fair manner, And I think the US can and should play a role in supporting election observers and even providing training and assistance to these independent groups that Eric and I were describing, who really, I think, offer the kind of the ray of hope that is still there for this country if they can be empowered, if they can translate their street protests and demonstrations into real political power. So I'll stop there.
Well, if you guys are ready, then I will chime in with some of the audience questions. And so the first question comes from Bob Rush. And Eric, I think I'll direct this question to you because I think you started to get there when you were discussing Lebanon's identity politics. What changes would you recommend to the Lebanese form of government, and is that realistic?
I don't think it's realistic, at least in the current circumstances and dynamics. I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think it's going to be a gradual, slow change. I think it's going to be a painful change. My one concern is that, you know, with groups like Hezbollah has the ability to intimidate some of these more independent actors, could further slow down that change. The problem is an illness of the Lebanese that has been ingrained for, you know, generations, and that it's not something that's going to be fixed overnight or in a matter of a couple of years. You know, we're talking probably decades to you know, release themselves, if you want to use this kind of term, release themselves from this kind of sectarian identity. And I've had friends kind of say, you know, they've been in environments where, you know, there's a party that is kind of pro-environment, but the default is always back to kind of the sectarian identity. So, and this is something that is, you know, and I'm not Lebanese, but my experiences is, you know, ingratiated at the dinner table growing up. Maybe one of the issues that could be addressed is that there's a propensity of the Lebanese to, particularly in their early years, to go to schools that are religious schools, and maybe creating a educational system where those religious identities are not as acute may contribute to that. But historically, the religious schools have been better than the Lebanese public schools, from my knowledge. So, and then there's also elements from the war that still linger. I have a friend, you know, we have a question here on the side about the relations between Muslims and Christians. I have a friend who is Christian, who would vote for the Muslim side, particularly groups like Hezbollah, because their experience with other Christians. This goes back to the war, where, you know, problems are not always between the sects, their problems are within the sects. And you had a particularly violent episode within the Christian community towards the end of the Lebanese civil war that has led to a bad taste in people's mouths. And that's not going to go away anytime soon. So, and, you know, they're going to tell that to the next generation. So we're talking probably a generation or two before those feelings are really going to, you know, recede. I lived in a dormitory, a Christian dormitory in an area called Sassine, which is in kind of the east part of Beirut. And, you know, I remember the guys, and this is going back now almost 20 years, where there was intense friction between guys, you know, supporting one political party within the Christian community versus another and another. So I don't see a kind of a, you know, true resolution to this anytime soon. And the and I don't see a solution to it anytime soon.
Well, so this brings up Dave's question, and Mona, I'll direct this to you. How can change come on gradually if the country's on the verge of collapse? I mean, it seems like a crisis that maybe some sweeping change should happen now.
Well, it's a great question. As I said, I think what needs to happen now is immediate actions to stave off a collapse. And the way that needs to be done, as I said, is preferencing this idea of humanitarian assistance. Now is not the time for revolution in the street. In fact, my concern has been that you could see a collapse perpetuated by bottom-up massive protests, more frankly, food and hunger protests and strikes, and an increasingly angry and impoverished Lebanese population that ends up fomenting a social explosion. That's not what is going to help save the country. So I think it is in a crisis. So we need to understand, okay, how do we address the immediate manifestation of the crisis? Again, it's largely humanitarian. And then for change to be sustainable and peaceful, it needs to be gradual. And elections is a great, that is a legal approach to change. One thing I would add, though, one thing I think is important to understand about Lebanon. Well, we've talked a lot about this confessional system of governance, right? Where you have basically what sect or confession you identify with drives everything, drives government positions, etc. That's not the final vision for Lebanon as of the end of the Civil War. The Ta'if Agreement, which ended the Civil War, actually envisioned taking the sectarian politics and putting them into an upper house in the parliament so that the sectarian issues would be played out there, and you would have a civil state that's not dictated and determined by confession or identity politics. It never made it for all kinds of reasons, but I don't think that it's impossible, but I would certainly agree. This is a long-term proposition. Things are not going to change in Lebanon overnight.
Our next question comes from Bill, and Eric, I'll turn this question to you. If the country can't be turned around and literally dissolves or is a failed state, then who's going to go in then? And, are we going to have a situation like Afghanistan where you have the Taliban take over? Could Hezbollah with Iran in the background take over? Would it be someone else? What happens?
I think it'll remain the same. Hezbollah is going to prop up what it has here because it allows Hezbollah to operate kind of within the international system. The Lebanese state and how it kind of operates right now provides a certain cover for Hezbollah. So I think what you'll see if you have further collapse, you'll have a strengthened Hezbollah. I think Hezbollah, yes, the militia, is a political party, but also to a certain extent is institution. So there's going to be some resilience there vis-a-vis the other communities and other organizations. It still will suffer, but I think it will maintain a certain sense of coherence, integrity. I think the other issue, or another way to maybe characterize it, it is going to be increasingly kind of an Iranian satellite state, and that Hezbollah's leverage over outcomes in Lebanon will grow. And I think it's going to grow further because, for example, the Speaker of the Parliament is a Shia. Guy's name is Nabih Berri. He's been there since the end of the war. I don't know how he's still alive, but he's going to die one day, and he has a party behind him. But what we've seen with a lot of these kind of elites and their political parties, their scions, the next generation is not as strong as the initial generation. We see it with groups, with families like the Jamils, the Karami, Salam, and even the Hariri family. The son who has filled the shoes of the father has been more or less a failure in trying to advance policy. So I think Hezbollah is going to do what it can to kind of prop up the state, the Lebanese state, the way it is. I think you're going to see probably a willingness of European powers to kind of continue to interact with it and allow that state to continue to survive. One thing I wanted to add, going back to what Mona said, one of the dangers of this kind of helping the Lebanese is that my fear is we're going to create a welfare state here. And unfortunately, when we look at the history of the Lebanese have been throughout time very dependent from this external support. And I think, the Americans right now are trying to provide electricity. And I think it prevents the Lebanese from doing it themselves. And I think this is one of the biggest dangers going forward in Lebanon. And here, I think we need to find Lebanese who believe in Lebanon and are not willing to immigrate somewhere else. And I think this is the biggest challenge going forward, because we need to find Lebanese who believe in Lebanon, and that we see this in places like Afghanistan. We've seen it in other countries where we've tried to prop up these governments, and ultimately they implode the moment we leave. So I am concerned that we are going to create a welfare state there.
So we have just a few more minutes, so this will probably be our last question, and I'll direct it to Mona. This comes from Stephen. Essentially, he's asking, should Lebanon even exist? He asks, is Lebanon a viable state with so many sectarian interests, a history of colonialism, boundaries defined from outside? Does Lebanon have a form of government suitable to form a viable state, and who rallies behind the Lebanese flag?
Well, I think Lebanon is a viable state. And there is clearly a Lebanese identity. It's expressed in many, many ways, to the dialect of Arabic that is spoken, to the food, to the culture, as I said, to this diaspora that's deeply connected. There's very clearly a Lebanese identity, and Lebanon is a viable state. What's not viable is the corruption, is the lack of accountability, that has been the case now for decades. And so I think we have to be very careful not to conflate the failure of governance with a failing of the Lebanese people. I don't think that is the case. I think that Lebanon, we see the dynamism of the Lebanese. They are among the most resilient people. And quite frankly, I mean, I think if unleashed, their entrepreneurial spirit, their ability to solve problems, which is pretty amazing when you see it, really could build an incredibly vibrant anchor on the Eastern Mediterranean. I take Eric's point about the fear of a welfare state. I don't see that happening, because we're not pouring aid into Lebanon. We are saying no aid to Lebanon unless and until the government undertakes these reforms. I see that we only have a couple of minutes, but I did see a question about what kinds of pressure tactics can the US government employ. And what can be done is, together with our European allies, the threat of targeted sanctions on corrupt individuals who are inhibiting the forward movement of these very necessary reforms. The Biden administration has already started doing it. The Trump administration did it before. But the Biden administration is now doing it with the very express purpose of saying, this administration puts anti-corruption. We're seeing it this week with the Democracy Summit here in Washington. Anti-corruption measures are a key priority for the Biden administration. Those kinds of measures and tactics, in particular, pressuring corrupt leaders who refuse to put in place the kinds of reforms that are necessary to put Lebanon on a much more stable trajectory, that can be in my view, the threat of those, credible threat of those kinds of targeted sanctions, together with our European allies, could well make a difference. I have not fully lost hope in Lebanon. As tough and difficult as the situation is, it is a vibrant, unique country. If its people are allowed to sort of realize their aspirations, I think it can be a success story in the Middle East. And I continue to believe that we need to do everything we can to help enable that to happen.
Well,
Mona, Eric, thank you both so much. Eric, did you have one last comment?
Just one question, just to kind of build off what Mona said, and to answer Stephen's question. One of the things we sometimes forget about with these states is that, as Mona mentioned earlier, it's almost only 100 years, and these states go through processes. And you look at the state processes in Europe, and those occurred over centuries. And a lot of these Middle Eastern states are 100 years less than, if you want to talk about Lebanon's independence, 1943, are less than 100 years. And that, these processes take time. So that's another way to kind of look at this. And states aren't disappearing, they're not disintegrating as we see. They relatively stay the same. And the other thing too is that there was talk in the Lebanese Civil War of areas breaking apart, and Lebanon survived the Civil War. So I don't think it goes it's not going anywhere. The question is how well it will function in the future, I think is the big question.
Well, I know we had a diverse audience tonight. Some people have been to Lebanon, some have lived in Lebanon, and some have never been there. And I feel like this program still brought new information to everybody, especially the people starting at zero, like myself, or the people with some familiarity. One thing we didn't really get to talk about, kind of beyond the scope of the program, but certainly should be addressed, is Lebanon's a beautiful little place, and probably one of the reasons why it's somewhat heartbreaking that they're going through the troubles that they are right now. But Mona, Eric, thank you so much for your expertise. For the people who tuned in this evening, thank you once again for the wonderful questions. And I hope you will join us next week for our program with Bob and Greg Vanerick. Good night, everyone, and thank you.